of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you, for 20 days now, went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated, actually very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, it just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue.
Which is that the view of addiction promulgated by the mainstream media and the official rhetoric has proven inadequate for the 21st century. That is to say, there is an official view.
Tell me, what got you so passionate about this issue in the first place?
Oh, a million years ago, when I was a young psychologist, I found myself in the downtown east side of Vancouver and working amongst very hard-pressed people, heroin addicts, and it was all new to me. It came from nowhere in my life, and they really changed my life. They taught me so much.
So this has been your life's work for
40
years.
No, sorry, 40 years.
40 years. How are addiction and mental health related?
They're similar in the sense that they're all an expression of something wrong with society. I mean, we have big mental health problems and big addiction problems, and we know something's wrong. We don't know exactly what's wrong. They're different in the sense that we're moving in mental health effectively by medicalizing things. For example, the classic example is epilepsy. We used to think epileptics were possessed by the devil. Now we know they have a brain problem, and really that takes care of the problem in a very good way. Addiction's a little simpler. It has to go through a little different. It has to go through a 3-stage process. We used to think that addicts were essentially possessed by the devil, just bad people. And then we thought, well, we can medicalize it, it's a brain problem. But that hasn't worked out exactly as well as we thought it would. And now we have to move on to a third step, which is that addiction is really a social problem, and it must be understood on yet another level. So our problem is not that we haven't medicalized it enough. Our problem really is we've forgotten our history.
So why are so many people dangerously addicted to things that are not good for them?
Well, I have to say first that you have to realize that people are dangerously addicted to all kinds of things. It isn't just drugs and alcohol. It's sex, it's gambling, it's the internet, it's 1,000 things. And drugs and alcohol are a part of that, but not the majority.
Well, let's cut it in half then. You can be dangerously addicted, as I am, to loving the Toronto Maple Leafs, or you can be dangerously addicted to heroin. My addiction's not going to see me ending up in the gutter some night and having my life fall apart, I don't think. But being addicted to heroin could do that to you, right?
I'm sure you're not going to wind up in the gutter, Steve. And there are lots of people who are just in a minor way addicted to sports. You may not even be that. You may just love the Maple Leafs like I love the Canucks. That's possible.
Sorry about that.
It's too late now. But there are minor addictions to sports. They're not going to hurt anybody. But think about people who are majorly addicted to sports. Think about people who, have gone on fighting or playing long beyond the time when they were able. They can't give it up. They keep going on, trying to reclaim that glory, and eventually they do great harm to themselves. They can even kill themselves. So there are serious addictions to sports. There are serious addictions to lots and lots of things, and there's a part of the history we've forgotten, you see. We think, oh no, only addiction is really serious, but I mean, just go back a few centuries. Our ancestors all knew that there are serious addictions to all kinds of things, and somehow we forgot it in our frenzy to deal with drugs and alcohol.
Let me read an excerpt here from your book, The Globalization of Addiction. It goes like this. Global society is drowning in addiction to drug use and 1,000 other habits. This is because people around the world, rich and poor alike, are being torn from the close ties to family, culture, and traditional spirituality that constituted the normal fabric of life in pre-modern times. This kind of global society subjects people to unrelenting pressures towards individualism and competition, dislocating them from social life. Now, this is interesting because it suggests that society's got a big role in this addiction. It's not just a chemical thing or something going on in your brain or a need for a fix of tobacco or something. There's more to it than that.
That's right. We have to go beyond the brain, really, to understand addiction. We have to go into the fact that it's a consequence of certain kinds of societies, not all kinds of societies.
But Western consumer-oriented,
exactly.
Individualistic societies.
Actually, ours turns out to be a society which, for all its benefits and all the things we love that it produces, it has a big side effect. And one of the side effects is addiction. Another, I would say, is depression. And we have to deal with that. We can't deal with it by medicalizing it. That is, we can invent new kinds of treatment. We can do all kinds of things. We have all kinds of solutions that we're familiar with. They are not going to solve it for us. We have to look at the social cause, and we have to remedy the social cause. It's not easy.
So is that to say that I'm just going to pull something out of thin air here, and a more Eastern-oriented culture that had a more Zen-like state as part of its foundation wouldn't suffer from these kind of addictive tendencies?
No, I don't think so.
You don't want to go there.
I mean, the kind of industrialization, the kind of sort of hyper-capitalism that we're suffering from now is Eastern and Western. It's global. We're not going to get out of this by meditating. We're going to get out of it by really looking at what society does to people and remedying it. And when I start saying this, people get nervous and they think, well, I'm saying, well, we've got to get rid of capitalism and go to communism. But no, the Cold War is over. Well, what we're talking about here is a way of taking capitalism as an established life form that we live in and we live within, and domesticating it so that it doesn't do so much harm to our children.
Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect.